Hello and welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm John Bachman. Joining us now in studio is Dr. Daniel Pipes. He is the president of the Middle East Forum. He also contributes regularly to the National Review and the Washington Times. He's honored to have him with us here. Dr. Pipes, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for hosting me.
I know you've been writing a lot recently about President Obama's trip to Israel, and you just wrote about a very important statement that the president made that was largely overlooked by most of the media, in which the president urged the Palestinians to identify Israel as the quote-unquote Jewish state. Why was this so important, and how will this change the dynamic in the Arab-Israeli peace conflict?
It used to be assumed that the Arabs need to accept Israel, just that, Israel. But then, about a decade ago, the Arabs who live in Israel said, fine, we accept Israel. But Israel has to become a binational state, a state of its citizens, a homeland for everyone. In other words, it has to be not a Jewish state, just a state that happens to have Jews and Muslims and Christians in it. At which point it became clear that accepting Israel no longer means very much. It's Palestine under a different name, Israel. At which point in 2007, the then Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, said, you have to accept us as a Jewish state. It's not just enough to accept Israel. And since that time, he and the subsequent Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, have been reiterating this point. American presidents, Bush and Obama, have called Israel the Jewish state. But until a couple weeks ago, when Obama addressed the Palestinians and said they had to accept Israel as a Jewish state, it was not American policy. This is a major step towards Israel, because the Palestinians have universally said, never, no way, we refuse to do this. So by making this a demand of the U.S. government, Obama has shifted the entire basis of diplomacy. It's surprising. I mean, I, like almost everyone, anticipated Obama to be really tough with the Israelis, and in fact he came out in this way and in other ways very warm and close to them. What's his game? I'm not sure. I can speculate for you, but I don't know. I mean, it's a real surprise.
And we'll get into this more in a second, but real quickly, was this a way for President Obama to get Netanyahu to apologize to Turkey? This clearly wasn't just done out of his own volition, right? There has to be some trade-off here.
Presumably, my speculation would be yes, but more than just an apology to Turkey. Rather, there are two schools of thought in the Democratic Party. One is that if you want the Israelis to do your bidding, fight them, show them who's boss. And that's what Obama did the first administration, and it failed completely. The second school of thought says, if you want the Israelis to do your bidding, get real close to them, win them, have them trust you. And I think that's what we're now seeing, is a completely different approach to the Israelis, with the intent to get the Israelis to do the American bidding. One small bit of that might be the apology to Turkey, but there are many more things, Iran, the Palestinians. From my point of view, as someone who is not real keen on the Obama administration's outlook on foreign policy, I didn't mind the cool relations with Israel, because it meant the Israelis didn't do the Obama administration's bidding. I like it viscerally. I'm glad there are warm relations and so forth, but I'm not so keen on the implications that I expect will follow.
So we'll stay tuned there and see what other changes might come as a result of that. Let's do focus in a little bit more on the apology, the Mavi Marmara incident, the Gaza flotilla raid, as it's also known. Several Turkish nationals died, others were injured as a result of that. We also saw Benjamin Netanyahu recently apologize for that, which got a lot of attention. I know you wrote that you were appalled by the apology initially, but you've had a change of heart. Why have you had a change of heart?
Well, I started out by being appalled because I think it was the Turks who need to apologize to the Israelis. This was a provocation supported by the Turkish government, which they have used mercilessly to batter Israel with. And the Israelis may not have been tactically perfect, but they were protecting their own interests. So I was appalled. My second thoughts came because in the aftermath of the apology, which is now about 10 days ago, the Turks have been, Erdogan, the Prime Minister, and others, have been pushing relentlessly, gloating over this, putting up signs, talking about it, saying, wow, we win, they lose. And so the reaction in Israel has been, oh, maybe this wasn't such a good idea. In other words, until this apology came, many Israelis thought, all we have to do is apologize and things will be fine. people like me said, no, they won't be fine. What you have in Ankara is not a peaked prime minister who's annoyed by something. You have an ideologue, an Islamist ideologue, who wants to use this as a building block towards his grand vision of Turkey's place in the world. Don't do it. And that's precisely what he did, and the Israelis have picked up on this. And so perhaps it is a good thing in retrospect that the Israelis paid this price and learned this lesson, and now they're no longer in the illusion that they can win back Ankara. I hope our government is disabused of that illusion as well. I mean, I see the government in Turkey as increasingly rogue, as increasingly hostile. And our president hugs the prime minister, and our former secretary of state high-fived their foreign minister, and they're great, wonderful relations, and I'm not happy about that.
Is that because Turkey really is the only option right now in the region? I mean, Israel has to have a partner in a peace process. Egypt doesn't seem to be capable of doing that right now. Obviously, Syria is deteriorating. Iraq is still not stable yet. Who, if not Turkey, then who?
Well, 2 points. One, you don't have to have a peace process partner if there is none. I mean, if there is none, there's no peace process. You don't have to have one. You wait for one to come along. And secondly, Turkey couldn't be part of that. There is no negotiating with Turkey. What the Turks could have provided would be an honest broker, like the U.S. government. The Turks themselves have no specific issue with Israel. They're far away. But you're getting to a point which I think is important, which is that the U.S. government tends to see Turkey as the friendly state, other than Israel. Big Muslim state, doing well economically, member of NATO, all of which I subscribed to until a decade ago. It was the model Muslim state, more democratic, better economic growth, and more Western-oriented. I don't think that's true anymore. Turkey has changed. The government has very much changed. It is a hostile government. It is an Islamist government. It is not that different from governments, say, in Egypt or Iran. It's just a lot more careful about it, moving more slowly. But it's going in the same direction.
Well, let's talk about Egypt a little bit more. There's several disturbing items to deal with, and that includes the recent arrest of the popular Egyptian satirist Bassem Youssef. He's now out on bond, but he could go back to jail for defaming, these are the official charges, Islam and President Morsi. This is a clear sign that the Morsi government is beholden to the more radical wings of the Muslim Brotherhood, and that they're no better off now than they were in the previous regime.
I think the comparison between Erdogan and Morsi is a good one. Erdogan has been in power for 10 years and has moved very carefully, slowly, and has done what he's done with popular support. So it puts someone like me in a tough position, because I think he's terrible, and yet he's got popular support and he's moving slowly. Morsi has got the same goals, but is moving very quickly and very poorly. Tactically, he's making mistake after mistake. And so what you have is rebellion. You have a city like Port Said, which is an open revolt. You have the streets are full of resistance to what Morsi's trying to do. So I don't think the problem is so much here his ideology. I think it's that he's grasping for power too quickly and doing too much to take power, and not paying attention to the very real problems that Egypt has, in particular the economic problems. Egypt is facing economic catastrophe. Hunger is on the horizon. And all Morsi's doing is accruing power. So I think the Egyptians would have gone along with his government had he been more intelligent about it. His big mistake is that he's grasping for power and ignoring other issues. And the results are really quite astonishing. I mean, he doesn't control the country. The military is not under his control, the intelligence services, the police, the street, certain cities. He's got major problems.
Some of the comments that we've heard from Morsi just this year, dating back to January, he said that Jews are descended from pigs and from apes. He's ramped up his rhetoric. This, to you, is a response trying to appeal to the more radical Islamists in Egypt?
No, I'd say the reverse, actually. The quote you just cited is from a couple of years ago. It was pulled out of the archive only earlier this year. No, he's toned down somewhat his rhetoric. And indeed, most interestingly, he has tamped down Hamas in Gaza. Under Mubarak, Mubarak was quite happy to have Hamas shooting rockets into Israel and have all sorts of make trouble for Israel. But Morsi, who theoretically is more anti-Israel, in fact has tamped down Hamas because he doesn't want trouble there, because he's trying to get power. He's trying to get himself stronger at home. So he generally has avoided incendiary statements like that. He's just interested in getting power. So Bassam Youssef, as you mentioned earlier, is under arrest because he's challenging in television very publicly Morsi's power. It's all about power. He's not really trying to apply Islamic laws at this point. He's just trying to get himself established securely in power. And because he's so determined to do that, ironically, he's not succeeding.
And having the reverse effect as
Exactly.
a result. You mentioned the Egyptian military. Where are they now in all this? There's a long relationship of U.S. cooperation with the Egyptian militaries. They have trained on our bases here domestically. We've also heard a lot of talk about the potential of cutting off U.S. aid to Egypt. What happens if we do make that move?
The argument in favor of sending aid to the military is to sustain that mill-mill relationship, to keep lines open, to keep the Egyptian military happy with us. And there's a reasonable argument to be made for it. I'm against it. I don't think at this point we should be supplying very substantial amounts of money to the Egyptian military, which is in effect a force unto itself, and which doesn't need, as it just received, all these Abrams tanks and I forget, F-16s, I think it was. It's not exactly the urgent need for Egypt today. I don't think we should, and the Egyptian military is not exactly our friend. Granted, it's not working with Morsi that closely, but this is essentially a fascist institution that ran the country, in effect, since 1952 and ran it into the ground. There are a lot of unsavory elements in the Middle East, be they Islamist or military, for the most part. My policy is to never work with the Islamists, work very carefully at a distance with the military, and try and help the liberals, the moderates, the seculars, who may be distant from power, but who are the only escape from the predicament that a country like Egypt is in. And they were out in force in Tahrir Square a couple of years ago. Granted, they didn't coalesce and take power, but they're the ones we should be helping, not the military, not the Islamists. These are not our friends. These are not people who are good for our interests in the long term.
And how do you help that group of people right now? What's the strategy to accomplish that?
Well, it differs in different countries, but in Egypt, it would be funding them, celebrating them, doing everything that our government and others, private and public institutions, can do to support the people who look to us for inspiration, who look to us for moral support, who see us as inspiration for what they can achieve there. And they do exist, and they are motivated. It's just that between the Islamists and the military, they get blocked. So it's difficult, but we have to deal with the Islamists and the military, to be sure. But we should focus on helping them, sending them the money, not the military.
And perhaps even more important now, what you talked about with the economy in such desperate shape in Egypt. I want to move on to Syria and wrap up on this topic, because this is kind of the big elephant in the region, so to speak. The ongoing debate in Washington is, should the U.S. military jump in? Should the U.S. military bomb the Syrian Air Force? Is it too late? You've written, in its somewhat controversial position, that the best thing that for U.S. strategically would be if this conflict drags on for as long as possible. Why do you make that argument?
I look at the two sides, again, military and Islamist, or Ba'athist and Islamist. I mean, both unsavory in the extreme. And I don't want either side to win. I don't want Assad to come out of this victorious, and I don't want the rebels to win and take over Damascus, take over the country, and have a new Islamist government in the Middle East, supported by the Turks, as opposed to the existing regime which is supported by the Iranians. I mean, none of them do I want. So what's the best outcome? The best outcome is that nobody wins. How do you achieve that? Well, you achieve that by having the fighting continue. Now, the problem with the fighting is that it is close to the cities. It's in the cities. It's killing civilians. But I would like to use our influence to exert it on the Turks, the Russians, the Saudis, the Qataris, the Chinese, to get their clients to fight in a clean way, away from the populated areas. But I don't want to see anyone win here. I think they're all disastrous. They're horrid. And you know, they're both engaged in war crimes, both sides. They're both, I mean, I shudder to think what it would be like were the rebels to take over in Damascus. It would be as bad, if not worse, than the Assad regime.
But that said, the momentum is on the side of the rebels at this point. Is there any way out of this without the Islamist rebels taking control of Syria?
Well, that's why I conclude that we should support the Assad regime, not the rebels. I want to see it go on, and I think, as you point out, the rebels have the wind behind them, so we should help the side that's losing. We've done this before. We did this in the Iraq-Iran war in the 1980s, both, again, horrid regimes. Saddam Hussein against Khomeini. I mean, how can you get worse than that? And we supported the losing side. We supported Saddam Hussein. And in some sense, we did the same in the 1940s. We supported Stalin against Hitler. I mean, what kind of a choice is that? We supported the side that was losing, so it didn't lose. We didn't want Hitler to take over Russia. We stopped that. Now, I mean, you got Stalin, a much more powerful Stalin as a result. Well, okay, that's the price we paid. But in retrospect, it was the right decision in the 1940s and the 1980s, and I think we should apply that same logic today. It is a strategic logic. It is not a humanitarian logic. I'm focused on our interests as Americans. Now, my heart goes out to the Syrians, but I think we should approach the Syrian problem from the American strategic point of view.
Would there not be longer-term political repercussions of that strategy? And I guess what would be worse, having a radical Islamist regime take control of Syria, or the long-term political consequences of taking that type of a strategy based solely on U.S. interests?
Well, by implication, I think it's worse to have a radical Islamist regime in Damascus. It's worse to have an Iranian-backed Assad regime strong in Damascus. I'm glad that it's weakened. It's a horrid regime, both in terms of human rights, in terms of strategic implications, in terms of Iran's best friend in the Middle East. I have nothing good to say about it, except that it is at war with the rebels, which is keeping them out of our harm's way, as it were. There's an apocryphal quote of Henry Kissinger in the 1980s that he wished that both sides could lose in the Iraq-Iran war. Well, that's what I wish for here. I want both sides to lose.
Clearly no clear way forward, or else this still wouldn't be a discussion 2 years later after the start of this conflict. Daniel Pipes, thanks so much for being with us. Enlightening conversation, a pleasure.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching Newsmax TV.